Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Beth Ribet. I'm the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. Our subject today is Veterans Affairs, and I'm looking forward to diving more into the subject. But I'd like to begin first with a land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanuk Fatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives in the past, present, and emerging. As I mentioned, our subject today focuses on Veterans Affairs. Most of you are already familiar that a veteran is defined as a person who has served in the United States military in the past. So not a current service member, but someone who has been in military service at any past time during their lifetime. The present estimate is that veterans in the United States are about 18 million people, and that makes up about 5.5% of the US population. Most of the 18 million are male, but about 2 million are women. And in addition to those 18 million, another 480,000 approximately are currently in military service. So not classified as veterans yet, but will be at some future point. The US military is generally understood to be the largest single employer in the United States. So our aim today is to focus on the policies and politics that affect former military. And policies affecting veterans is a complicated subject in part because there's just so much of it. So just in 2020, the US states, the District of Columbia and Territories, and the US government collectively sponsored 824 different bills. Again, this was just last year that affected either veterans or current military or both. And since 2010, the record indicates that we've 184 combined state and federal bills produced, though of course not all of these have passed and become law. And this is thanks to the record keeping on this is thanks to the National Conference of State Legislatures. So I want to stress that there is no one person who is familiar with all of the policy affecting veterans, nor is there even one entity that's unilaterally responsible for tracking all of it. Although there are certainly entities that make a significant effort. So I'm going to break this down into talking about a few areas. I'm going to start with healthcare and then move more briefly into employment and discrimination, education, disability benefits, and then a little bit more about what we know about patterns of service. So beginning with healthcare as noted, there's been an ongoing dynamic in recent and prior decades that military recruiters have recruited people into the military by telling them that if they join the military, they'll receive free health care for life, both for themselves and for their dependents, the immediate family members, which can include spouse and children. So one of the challenges is that while military recruiters have made this promise, the government has basically said, well, we're not bound by it and we don't have to uphold it. And this question has been litigated several times. One of the most significant went to the Federal Court of Appeals in 2002. And what the court found was that for a military recruiter does not constitute a contract and is not enforceable. So if a military recruiter acting on behalf of the US military promises you something about as a condition of your recruitment, the government is not bound by it. The government does not have to honor that promise. So this was heard in 2002 at the appellate level, the Court of Appeals for the federal courts, and the Supreme Court denied hearing it at all. And so that became the standing doctrine. So in essence, whatever you're promised by a recruiter is not enforceable unless it's already codified in existing legislation. So now that we know that being in the military does not necessarily guarantee free healthcare for life for service members and their dependents, what does it mean? Well, for veterans, according to the Congressional Research Services, veterans and their families can be treated at military facilities if there are enough space and staff and at the complete discretion of the military. So basically, nothing is firmly guaranteed. Rights and benefits can be taken away because of shortages, and the military can, for its own reasons, deny access to some benefits and resources. In practice, veterans can also find obstacles to care depending on whether they can establish that a particular condition is service-related. Sometimes this is not an obstacle, but service members certainly have recorded that it can be. So it's easy to establish, for instance, if you suffered an injury in the military and lost a limb, that that's service-related. It can be trickier both with psychiatric and medical conditions that may have one or more causes. So it might be true that military service is the primary cause, but there may have been other contributing factors. Imagine, for instance, if you suffer occasionally from depression before enrolling in military service and you leave service with relentless and severe clinical depression. The challenge, of course, is to establish that a condition that pre-existed your military service is service-related, even if your military service can significantly escalated the diagnosis. This is also at issue, for instance, for people who are exposed to toxins or biowarfare and then develop cancer, because there's too much that we don't understand about it, because it's hard to prove that exactly one factor was a primary cause. Sometimes this can be an obstacle to service members getting health care. And again, this varies in part because the policy is constantly evolving, because there are differences in what benefits are accessible in different regions, states, and facilities. So there's no one-size-fits-all rule, but if you can't establish that something is service-related, you definitely will not get treatment. But this can be an issue, and service members have found it to be. In 2014, in response to public scandal about veterans not receiving health care, Congress passed the Veterans Choice and Accountability Act, also known as the Choice Act, which allows veterans to secure health care and have the government essentially pay at least some portion of it from an outside provider who's not with the Veterans Administration when it's been demonstrated that the VA is inaccessible because the patient has not been able to get an appointment in a timely way, or the patient is not close enough to any VA facility to access it. So again, this was passed in 2014 and created more options for veterans who were dealing with combat and combat-related medical conditions and were not receiving timely or effective or good care. However, there have been significant record-keeping challenges. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the Veterans Administration is, again, the single largest healthcare system in the United States, accountable for providing service to at least up to those 18 million people. Not all use it, but many are. And once we see more veterans seeing outside providers, the outside providers are supposed to forward records to the Veterans Administration and generally do, but there's been an enormous backlog in scanning and documenting and keeping those records updated within the VA. And the reason that that can be really significant is that if an outside doctor gives you a diagnosis but the VA has not updated, that can be an obstacle to you getting referred, for instance, to specialty care to deal with that diagnosis. So what we see is that while the Choice Act helped to improve the landscape, administrative problems within the Veterans Administration are significantly inhibiting the ability of the VA to coordinate care, including between the VA and outside providers. And this is according to the U.S. Office for the Inspector General. They actually found that the backlog of documents amounted to a stack of paper that if assembled vertically would be 5 miles high. Right? So a very significant challenge in managing just the level of documentation for this large population. One of the challenges and barriers to and delays in and issues with quality of care in the Veterans Administration, particularly when there's so much more demand than there is supply of staff, is that veterans at large have a lot of untreated trauma. So the estimates of post-traumatic stress disorder among veterans vary from as low as maybe 10 or 15% of all veterans currently suffering or recently suffering from PTSD to estimates that are as high as 30. And again, aside from the fact that this is a large population and not all are communicative or responsive to attempts to diagnose trauma, one of the things that we see at issue is conceptions of trauma and whether and when it's likely to be recognized, whether and when PTSD is likely to be diagnosed. So without getting into a much larger discussion about that subject, what we can say is that the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder among veterans is likely somewhat higher than the current estimates, which basically say at this moment, somewhere between 10 to 15% of vets have PTSD. And if we were to, for instance, move outwards and say how many have had it in the last 5 years, which can also predict recurrences, because even if you have post-traumatic stress disorder and then the symptoms subside, they may surface again in response to things which bring up or trigger that old trauma. And so if we were to expand to a 5-year span, how many have had PTSD in the last 5 years, then the statistics, of course, would go up. So there's a lot to engage there, but important to understand is that when you have a population that has a lot of untreated trauma, as well as delays in access to basic kinds of care, one of the things it can do is decrease life expectancy. And again, we don't have precise estimates here, but we know that significant levels of untreated trauma may lower your life expectancy by as much as 20 years. And it can do that because significant levels of unhealed trauma are very hard on the immune system, on the heart, in part because they result in the overproduction of stress hormones, such as cortisol in the body. So when veterans are dealing with unhealed trauma, untreated injuries and illnesses, and are not getting timely, stable, continuous care from providers who know their medical profiles, we see a reduction of life expectancy, a reduction in the ability to remain employed, loss of income. And again, economic challenges associated with unhealed trauma can be a combination of reduced ability to work and then just increased costs of living associated with dealing with trauma. So we can see that that's really deteriorate economically as a result of impaired access. Excuse me, my cat's trying to get in on the action. Impaired access to medical care. I'll talk a little more briefly today about a few other areas of veteran-related policy. One is discrimination, and the primary instrument which prohibits discrimination against a person who is either in military service or a former veteran is the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, also known as USERRA. So USERRA basically says you cannot discriminate against somebody, whether in hiring, promotion, or firing, or conditions of work, including pay, based on a record of military service. And it also, and this is one of the more challenging or complex parts of USERRA, allows for a service member to be reinstated in the same position that they would be at if they had not engaged in military service. So USERRA gives you a right to come back to a job that you have left if you leave it because you're called to duty. So in practice, USERRA does have certain enforcement mechanisms, so veterans who believe that they're experiencing employment discrimination have ways to issue a complaint and to pursue investigation. Like any form of discrimination, it can sometimes be quite difficult to prove that one is during discrimination. So this is not to say that the existence of USERRA means that veterans don't experience employment discrimination, but it does create recourse. The second law, which is recognized as protective for veterans, is actually the Americans with Disabilities Act. So USERRA and the ADA combined are the two, basically we would think of them as civil rights instruments, or the two anti-discrimination instruments. I think that would be more precise here, which are used to defend the rights of veterans. So, of course, in theory, not all veterans are protected by the Americans with Disabilities because not all veterans are recognized as having a disability, and there's some who would certainly say that they don't. But because the rates of injury, illness, and trauma are so substantially high among people who have been in military service, many are eligible for protection as persons with disabilities. And without getting into a larger discussion of disability rights, which is our subject for next week's session, in which we'll be hosting disability rights attorney Deborah Dorfman. The key thing Americans with Disabilities Act basically says is that if you are qualified to do a job, to fulfill the essential requirements or the essential functions of that job, and you can do so either without any disability accommodations, or you do need accommodations, but the law will recognize them as reasonable requests. They're not dangerous to others, they're not extraordinarily expensive, and they allow you to do the job. Then it becomes unlawful to discriminate against you in employment. And discrimination, again, can mean discriminatory conditions of work, including having an unfair workload or less pay or benefits, or something that's unsafe or unhealthy or unfair in the conditions of work otherwise. And it can also refer to hiring, firing, and promotions. So USERRA and the ADA are most commonly the laws that are used to protect veterans who feel that they're experiencing some form of employment discrimination. I next want to talk a little bit about education policy, and I'm going to focus primarily on what's known now as the post 9/11 GI Bill, which replaced prior incarnations. And GI can cover a fixed amount of the cost of education for private and public universities and colleges, including those outside the United States, and can provide a monthly housing allowance, which is somewhere a little over, I believe, $1,700. Maybe it may have been increased this year to about $1,800 per month. And that's maximum. So the GI Bill will calculate the cost of your housing based on the zip code of the university that you are enrolled at. So it may be significantly less than that amount, but in expensive parts of the country, it could cover up to $1,700 to $1,800 a month for housing while you are in school full-time, and can also reimburse or cover the cost of correspondence courses. And if you are taking courses completely online, you can still get a housing allowance, though it will be a bit under $900 a month, regardless of where you live at the time. So, and educational benefits are not a given right of every military service. There have to be a certain number of years of service. You have to be honorably discharged when you do pursue education. Generally, it's understood that if you have at least 4 years, it counts to the GI Bill, but the policy is complicated. So there can be some benefits you might access earlier and some that might take longer. I next want to talk about the Veterans Administration disability benefits compensation claims. And I'm not going to get into this very complex subject in any depth, but I want to acknowledge it because it's certainly one of the important areas of VA policy. So without getting into all of the details, the important thing to understand is that presently, VA disability benefits are suffering somewhat like record keeping and medical care from a major backlog in processing. And in addition, VA disability compensation claims may also be delayed because there can be, as noted earlier, challenges establishing that a disability is specifically a result of military service, especially if it may be the result of a combination of factors which the military played a role in. So disability benefits compensation claims are not always granted, of course, but even when they are, and there are no appeals and it just goes straight through, it can still take a significant amount of time, and it's varied and has gone up by several months in the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit next about who we know veterans to be. So we know that there's certain patterns of who serves in the military and how. And this includes differences based on race and gender and class. So we see that the majority of service members are male, though the representation of women is going up, that there are significant racial differences. So while the majority of service members and veterans are white, Black populations are disproportionately represented in military service, that they are underrepresented in the top levels of the military hierarchy. So they tend to be less represented among officers, more represented among rank and file military, and definitely underrepresented in the hierarchy of the Defense Department. Excuse me. We also notice that the disparate representation, so the overrepresentation of people of color in rank and file positions, is actually higher among men. The exact estimates vary, but we find that women of color are more likely to serve than white women, and that the, again, disparity is even higher than it is among males by race. The vulnerability of veterans after service interacts with racial discrimination. One of the ways it does so is to reduce employability. So when we track this, what we find is that there are higher rates of post-service unemployment among Black and Latinx veterans as opposed to white. And among veterans as opposed to those that come from middle or upper class backgrounds and are more commonly associated with higher positions within the military, with getting to serve as an officer. I want to say a little bit more about women veterans and trauma. One of the major issues that's been identified by the Department of Defense for women veterans involves the prevalence of military sexual assault. So approximately a quarter of women veterans will report when asked by the Veterans Administration that they were sexually assaulted at least one time during military service, and some report several times. And the statistic, as you might imagine, is even higher for sexual harassment, with more than half of the women who've been in military service reporting that they were harassed by someone who had power over them sexually. Men do report that they experience sexual assault in the military, and we have strong reasons to believe that sexual assault of male veterans when they are significantly underreported, in part because there's just a gender dynamic that many men just do not want to admit that it happened. But about 1 in 100 male veterans does report to the VA that they've experienced sexual assault. That's compared to about 1 in 4 among women. And again, I think that this disparity in statistics can be attributed to two things. One, it is happening to women more often. All the data we have supports that, but also it's happening to men more often than we recognize, but male veterans are less likely to be comfortable reporting. So I would say both statistics, the 1 in 4 for women, the 1 in 100 for men, are low, because there are always people who will not acknowledge that sexual assault occurred, but the statistics are alarming regardless. When you have people who have inadequate access to mental and physical health care and are trying to heal from or recover from a sexual assault, again, the implications for health and for life expectancy are significant. Untreated sexual trauma is associated with higher rate the development of conditions like depression, anxiety, disruption of sleep, higher rates of heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. So this is one of the areas that should be recognized as, basically of crisis proportions for veterans and disproportionately for women veterans. I also want to talk about, I talked initially about the fact that no one is guaranteed free health care for life for them or their dependents based on military service. But I also want to specifically talk about the subject of dishonorable discharge. So the U.S. military's position is that if you are discharged dishonorably from the U.S. military, you have no access to any benefits through the Veterans Administration of any kind, no health care, no disability benefits, anything else. And some of the response, well, if somebody did something bad enough to get court-martialed, then why should the state, be providing them with benefits? And this is certainly an important question. One thing to keep in mind is that a number of people who've been dishonorably discharged and passed over the years have been people who were court-martialed because they were lesbian, bisexual, gay, or transgender. And so if you were thrown out of the military based on your sexual orientation or gender identity, you would immediately and permanently lose all access to benefits. Now, no likely to be true as the military has, basically moved past the don't ask, don't tell era in military service, in which you could still be removed from service or dishonorably discharged for being LGBT, but you wouldn't be investigated about it as long as you were willing to basically hide it. But the changes are not retroactive. So veterans who've lost access to benefits based on sexual orientation and gender identity or been discharged for that reason don't get those benefits back. In addition, we do have some patterns of dishonorable discharge to people who have been discriminated against or have been victims of sexual assault or harassment in cases where an individual is being harassed based on their race or is being sexually harassed or assaulted and tries to report and is then basically accused of something by the powerful person who is harassing or abusing them. And due to the differences in power and military hierarchy, there are at least some alleged instances in which people have been dishonorably discharged, not based on any wrongdoing, but based on the fact that they were vulnerable, based on gender or race or some other characteristic. And again, I want to highlight that if you're dishonorably discharged, you're immediately and permanently ineligible for all benefits. So I want to share a book recommendation. Our book of the week is Uncle Sam's Shame, Inside Our Broken Veterans Administration, and the author is Martin Cantor, who worked as an administrator within the VA for a period of, I believe, about 2 decades. So again, that title is Uncle Sam's Shame, Inside Our Broken Veterans Administration by Martin Cantor. And for those who are with us in Zoom, I will put the book title in the chat for you in case you would like it. So for those who are repeated attendees, you know that the last thing that we do as part of each Civics Project episode is to work through a few trivia questions. So for those again who are with us in Zoom, I'm going to share trivia through screen share, and I'll also be reading it out loud for all those who are listening. So first question, and those who are with us are welcome to respond in the chat. What percentage of veterans in the United States will be women by 2025? Answer choice A is 10%, B is 12%, C is 15%, D is 18%. And the correct answer on this one is 12. The current estimate now is 10, but because the rates of military service have been increasing for women, we're starting to see the percentage of veterans who are female increase as well. So within the next 4 years, that rate should jump up about 2%. Second question, what 1990s movie focused on and was created to expose alleged dysfunction at U.S. Veterans Administration hospitals? What movie from the 90s focused on a problem with the VA? Answer choice A is Full Metal Jacket, B is Assault on VA 33, C is The Doctor, and D is Article 99. And the correct answer from 1992 is Article 99, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and Ray Liotta as VA doctors who were attempting to buck the system and treat patients who were being denied care because the Veterans Administration was saying that their medical needs were unrelated to their military service. 3, after filing a claim for disability compensation with the Veterans Administration, what is the average wait time for an initial decision? A, 153 days, B, 91 days, C, 320 days, D, 2 years. So according to the US government right now, in 2021, the average wait time is 153 days. It's actually 153.1, I believe. So this is how long from when you submit a claim for disability compensation before you get an initial decision. Of course, if you needed to file appeal, the award of potential disability compensation might take even longer, but this is average right now. So for our Zoom attendees, I'm including some links to more places that you can learn, and I'll be sure to share those in the chat as well. I want to thank everybody for listening in today and say a little bit more about what's upcoming. So we will be featuring Deborah Dorfman from Disability Rights Connecticut next week to talk about disability rights in the United States. She's a really wonderful attorney, so I hope many of you will get to hear her. And on May 30th, we're going to feature Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, the Vice President of Fair Count, which focuses on the U.S. Census and voting rights. I've heard Dr. Abrams-McLean interviewed before. She's very brilliant, so I'm really excited to get to host her and dialogue with her through the Civics Project. Some of you may also know her very famous sister, Stacey Abrams, who works with her on voting rights in Georgia. In addition, our movie for the week is, for the month rather, is United States of Conspiracy, and we'll be screening that on May 26th at 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern time. So I hope many of you will turn out. For those who register for today's Zoom session, you'll receive a link to register for future events. And if you are listening via podcast, you can also find our events registration page in the podcast description for this episode. Again, I really want to thank everybody who turned out today. I'm really glad to be able to be in dialogue with you.